what would you say was Kierkegaard's relationship to like a Lutheran or Luther? Because in some sense, his emphasis on faith does feel very Lutheran. And of course, Nietzsche then criticizes Luther on that emphasis on faith. But at the same time, you also almost have this idea that perhaps Kierkegaard's proclamation about objectivity doesn't seem to, or subjectivity instead, doesn't go as far as that Lutheran proclamation of faith. So almost in some sense, he is a Lutheran and he's not a Lutheran at the same time.
Yeah, so I think part of what you're asking we could narrate as a sort of hermeneutics, right? So how are we going to read Kierkegaard in light of a relation to Luther, but that's also in light of a relation to Lutheranism as displayed in Denmark in the early 19th century, right? And so I side with Jamie Ferreira here, who says that we should always assume Kierkegaard is closer to Luther unless he says otherwise. So I really do read Kierkegaard as a Lutheran thinker. This does not mean, however, that this is a limiting function, right? This isn't something that should worry those of us who are not Lutherans. Again, as a Pentecostal, I've written essays on what would it look like to read Kierkegaard kind of leaning toward Pentecostalism, and how might we get some stuff out of there that's really compelling as philosophers. And, some of the reviewers responded and said, this is ridiculous. He's not a Pentecostal. He's Lutheran. And I was like, I get that. But we can read Kierkegaard also towards Catholicism, like my buddy Chris Barnett is doing in amazing books. So Jack Mulder wrote a great book on it as well. I mean, so it's not saying we read Kierkegaard as leaning Lutheran in all ways unless he specifies otherwise. We should instead say, getting clear about where Kierkegaard stood doesn't mean that Kierkegaard can't help us stand where we are differently. So in relation to Luther, I think the big things are Kierkegaard is certainly following Luther in, you might say, the kind of grand gestures, sola fides, right? It is not about works that salvation or soteriology gets cashed out. It's in terms of faith. And yet, Kierkegaard does, and of course, a quick point on that. That's why Kierkegaard says that in order to enter faith, we have to overcome a purely ethical mindset, right? Because ethics is fundamentally about what ought I to do, what is acceptable, what is understood as the right works. You can't work your way, as it were, into the relation to God. This is what he calls a highest passion. We have to be entirely, you might say, given over to the invitation of Christ, which he later will talk about as, come all who are heavy burdened. And his response to this is, that's everybody, right? So there are moments in Kierkegaard, to be honest, that I would even say sound kind of universalist when he talks about the all, this come all, there is no precondition, there is no limit. But when he talks about soteriology, he doesn't talk a lot about atonement in technical ways. Instead, he talks about faith as a decision. But it's a decision we make at every minute, at every instant of life. Faith is, he says, the moment of decision, and the moment of decision is all of existence, right? So we're all always faithful, but we might be faithful to those aesthetic desires or those ethical commands and universals, or we might be faithful to this becoming a Christian task, which probably puts us at odds with being a Christian in our social spaces, right? So faithfulness is bigger than religion for Kierkegaard in this sense, right? That said, it's not about doing stuff. It's about becoming. It's about investing ourselves. But then he does write a book called Works of Love, which sure looks an awful lot like, here's what then you do in your Christianity relative to love your neighbor as yourself. And he says, I'm not going to give a treatise on love. I'm giving a treatise on what it means to put this in practice. But I don't think Kierkegaard sees that as some sort of works-based salvation. I think he sees this as, when you are in relation with somebody, you will do everything you can to be invested in the flourishing of that relation and loving that person. The same is true with God. So if we're in relation to God and we're trying to ever deeper be in that relation, and God says, hey, love your neighbor as yourself. All right, am I doing that? Am I living that out? Am I putting that in practice? So when Kierkegaard talks about works, when he talks about actions, when he talks about practices, I don't think this is at odds with Luther's conception of sola fides. I think it's instead a mode of like, again, we are embodied beings. So how do we care about each other? How do we live out what it is that we've decided will be the orientation of our faith, the orientation of our lived existence?